we're going to go over a number of points here, a number of sections. The thinking here is let's discuss what are the elements of a successful healthcare startup. But to start, just a word about background. As you heard, I have an MD, then got an MBA. Then I went into industry briefly before venture capital at Domain Associates, which is a biotech-focused fund. Really wanted to be on the company side, so switched over and went to Amicus Therapeutics, which is at the time was a small orphan disease startup. We took that public, went to a couple other biotech companies after that, then switched gears and went into consulting. And now I'm running a small company which is funded and owned by McKinsey, the consulting firm. And, but not in biotech, in data analytics. Our clients are biotech and pharmaceutical companies. So I won't spend any time talking about that, but if anybody does have an interest in data analytics and where big data in pharma is going, we can talk about that afterwards. Chris?
So I'm the director of the Center for Pain Medicine at Mass General. Work there seeing patients, treating a wide range of pain conditions, and overseeing clinical operations. We're also involved in clinical trials of new drugs and new devices. Also do a fair amount of work with startup medical device and drug companies, as well as with venture capital funds. Previous to that, worked in life science venture capital. Had opportunities. I actually saw Amicus Therapeutics, the company that he was at, that they took public prior to Greg joining them came through as a deal. And was able to invest in medical device companies and take some of them through to acquisition, as well as pharmaceutical companies, and take one of them up to going public.
Okay, terrific. So let's start off with this is a bit of a survey approach, but let's start off with we asked you guys the question, what are the key criteria? I'm going to put you guys on the spot right at the beginning. What are the key criteria that's necessary to get a successful company off the ground? And I think this is sort of relatively weighted. You know, what are the priority things that you need? And maybe some people who answered or people who didn't answer. You know, when you're thinking about starting a healthcare company, what are the first things that come to mind that you need? Innovation, okay. As a concept, that's great. If we put a bundle on innovation, how would you think about that?
Intellectual property.
Intellectual property, okay, that's a good choice. What else do you need to get a company started?
Big market.
You need but how do you own how do you possess that?
You have a healthcare problem.
Pardon?
You need to have a disease or a healthcare problem.
So I would put these things together is that you need a business model that's aimed at a large market. And you need to be able to articulate that.
Capital.
You need funding.
You need a team.
You need people. Exactly. Exactly. So I think I would agree with this was what the survey said. Intellectual property, we talked about business model, we talked about markets, et cetera. Particularly in a biotech or science-based company, the two key drivers here are intellectual property and clinical data. If you don't have clinical data, whatever can get you as close to clinical data as possible are the two major drivers. So I would say that in this, answering for biotech companies, you guys nailed it.
Although would jump in with one quick question in terms of, from the venture capital point of view, you obviously want to see a terrific team and you want to see great technology. Right? But if you have to choose between those two as an investor, as a venture capitalist, of either having a great team or having a great technology, which one do people think you would choose? I hear a lot of team. So who says team? Put your hand up. Okay. And who says a great technology? Home run. Okay. And let's hear for someone from technology. Anyone want to express a reason why? Why go with the super duper technology?
Yep.
I think with the right technology, probably get human capital resources to raise funding.
Yeah. So a point well made. With a great technology, you can raise funding, you can move it forward.
But not vice versa.
Yeah. And who said team? Somebody give me a reason why team.
No matter, there'll always be some problems with the technology. With a great team, you'll be able to push through them and actually bring it
And so what he said is that there will always be some problems with the technology, but a great team will be able to push it forward. And I can tell you, for us in venture capital, it was always for us, if you had to choose, you went with the better team. Because if the technology blew up, the drug has liver toxicity, we couldn't have figured that out until we got to the trial, but it's got liver toxicity, it's not going to be a drug for human beings. If you have a great team, you still have something. And remember, once we invested, we're in. So once we're in, it's like a marriage. You're in. And so if you have a great technology but a lousy team and that technology blows up, you've got nothing. If you've got a great team and your technology blows up, you still live to try again.
Great, great. So we're particularly, yes?
I just had a question. When you say clinical data, what do you actually mean by that? Because are there things that just start off with sort of an assay and then you get your data later?
Right, so the question is, what do we mean by clinical data? And yeah, that's a good point, that in a startup situation, you're probably not going to start with clinical data. You need to start somewhere. But my point is that biotechnology companies are valued based on clinical data. So if you don't have clinical data, it changes your valuation. Obviously, it goes down. But then they'll try to predict what the valuation based on hypothetical clinical data. And so there's some other points that will come up around, particularly around the way you manage the company and the way you drive it forward, that you should always be thinking about clinical data in particular. So so we analyze this from the point, IP data management team. So that's what makes sense for a biotech company. Can you guys think of a healthcare company situation where it would be reversed, not on the management team side, but where IP and data wouldn't necessarily be important? So in the health IT companies, yes, anybody want to speak up?
The same, which is healthcare services.
Healthcare services, health IT, exactly. The intellectual property situation is kind of reversed, that you actually want to protect what you've done more from a business process point of view rather than publishing it as intellectual property. And there's some trade-offs here, depending on what kind of company that you're thinking about forming. But just to get a sense of where people are coming from here, how many people here are interested or potentially interested in the first, biotech, medical products, that kind of stuff? So about 30% of the room. How many people are interested more in platform science and tools companies? So maybe about 10%. And how many are interested in health IT? So I'd say about 20%. Okay, good. And everyone else came for the free food. All right, this is going to be the longest list here. But what are the let's go. We started talking about this again. The key elements. So let's list it out and think about this. I'm going to try to focus your thinking a little bit. You're writing a business plan. What are the things that you want to articulate that you've got in the business plan? Or in other words, from a venture capitalist point of view, when you're looking at a startup, what do you want to check off and you say, A+, 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 A+. What's on that list? So we already talked about management team, we already talked about intellectual property, we talked about data. What else?
Good board.
A good board. What kind of, so the answer is a good board, but boards come in two flavors.
Big names.
So big names, that's the quality of the board. What I'm driving at is there's a board of directors and there's a scientific advisory board. So which one were you thinking?
I think you need a good board for both.
A good board for both, right?
That's the idea.
That's the right answer. That's right. Yes?
You probably mentioned funding already, but you need funding at least in the short term just to get you to your next step.
Some kind of immediate funding, bridge funding. Somebody mentioned plan. Yeah, we're sort of dissecting this, that if you get down into like the weeds of the plan, what goes into a plan? Imagine tomorrow that you have to sit down and write a business plan. What are the pieces that you're going to be writing about? Market. You need to understand what the market and analyze the market, right? So think about the business model. We'll be covering that in a little bit. What's that?
Competitors.
Who are the competitors? Exactly.
Research plan.
Product profile.
Product profile, exactly. Yeah.
Greg
Would be good to know what product you're making. You know, and you can think about that from the point of view of what's the product, what's the platform behind it, and it could be either one.
And I would add one point, and people who raise the thing about competitors, not infrequently you'll see a business plan where the list of competitors included is relatively short. One of the first things as a potential investor that you're going to do is do your homework and find out who are all the potential competitors. And I can tell you nothing will dissolve credibility more effectively and more quickly than if they give you a list of the business plan includes 4 competitors, you do your homework and you find 4 others that they didn't identify, because it's one of 2 possibilities. Either they don't know their area because they don't know the other 4 competitors, or they're dishonest. And I can't really decide which one of those is worse, but they're both terrible.
Good point. Yes.
I think another thing you have to look for critical risks to your technology, your point to
Yep.
what are the likelihood there's going to blow up.
That's a good point. What are the critical risk factors? How are you mitigating those risks? Now think of it again. You know, you're writing a presentation, you're writing a business plan, you're giving this to somebody. Regulatory strategy is a good one. Clinical strategy is a good one.
Differentiation.
What's your differentiating factors? Yep.
Area of entry.
Your area of entry.
Barriers.
Barriers to entry. Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah.
Forecasted revenue.
Forecasted revenue. That would be good. You know, would want to know how much money you're going to make. Speaking of money, anything else about that? Margins, operations. I mean, I'm even thinking simpler. You know, how much money are you asking for? What's that money going to take me to? What's the capital structure of the company? And what's the long-term financing plan? Okay, so I think you guys nailed everything. Location can be an important point here. You know, setting up a biotech company in Boston is not, is a good location. Setting up a biotech company in Nova Scotia, might raise some eyebrows, with all due respect to the Canadians. Business partnering strategy is another thing, but I think we hit everything else on the list. Product pipeline and platform. Okay. Yes.
Other than the fact that there are a lot of good hospitals and clinical availability in Boston, why else does it matter where you start at?
Great question. Why does it matter what your location is?
I'll give one answer to that. The venture capitalists who invest in your company are going to sit on your board, which means that they're going to have to go to your board meetings.
It's very true.
And that will either be a very short trip for them or a fairly long one to Nova Scotia.
So access to funding. Yep. Excellent. Access to human capital, advisors, key people. Exactly. That's and you've probably heard that there are clusters of certain industries. This is certainly a biotech cluster. Other areas have different IT clusters, et cetera, because it really revolves around a large company that has been successful but then sheds people out into the area. So it's much easier to run a healthcare company in this area than it would be,
And also, if you are trying to recruit a scientist and you recruit them to him or her to Nova Scotia, he or she probably knows that if your company folds, they've got to move again for their next job. So the barrier for bringing somebody on board to a risky startup may be a lot lower in Boston when they say, okay, I'll try to work in your company and maybe we'll hit it big or maybe it'll fold. But if it does, I don't have to move again. I'll just go down to Novartis and get a job as a medicinal chemist there.
That's right. All right, we talked about most of these things. All right, let's talk about funding sources.
All right. And just before I get started, shout out, what schools are people from, or what parts of the university or not part of the university are people from? Let's just hear some. Who's from the business school? All right. Who's from School of Public Health? Who's from the medical school? Who's from undergraduate? Nice.
Other
Good.
grad schools or
And
PhD programs?
Yeah, what am I missing?
Graduate School of Arts and Sciences.
Terrific, welcome. And anything else that I'm missing?
Bioeducation program.
Terrific, a PhD in biology. So what are the funding sources and considerations? Well, let's think about it. We've got a great idea. We've got some super smart people. We've got a team. We're going to go raise some money. What are all the different places that we could raise money from? Angels. NIH, grants. Yep. Others? SBIR. What else?
Venture competitions, things like that.
Yep, venture competitions. Could add venture capital funds to that. Family and friends, right? And some others. So let's talk about a few of the different advantages and disadvantages of each of these, right? Because they're all sources of potential money. And there must be some things that are going to be good about each of them and some things that are going to be bad about them. And the first thing we want to do is not just go and get the first money we can get. We want to think about where do we want to try to get money from and what's going to be good about that for us and what are going to be the drawbacks. So how about friends and family? What do you think what are some advantages to that? Easy access, I think I heard? Yeah.
Sucker.
Sorry? You can drive your own agenda?
Control is a big issue.
What else?
No interest.
Low interest? Yeah. And what are some disadvantages?
Burning bridges.
Thanksgiving? I thought about this a lot. That's great. That's great. What else?
The amount of funding they can actually give.
The amount of funding they can give. Yeah, so I think so friends and family, right? It's going to be easy to get to them. They think you're geniuses. You know, you got into the graduate thing, you got into undergraduate. Come on, their due diligence process is going to be short. They'll be decisive. They'll probably, unless you tell me what your family name is, you're probably going to get a relatively small amount of money. They're not going to know much about biotech or building a company, probably. You may have to actually spend a lot of time managing them because their expectations, you're such a genius, they think you're going to get that drug developed, approved, and commercialized within 12 to 14 months after that initial conversation when they wrote you the check. And the biggest downside, I would say, is that when they're sure that you're going to succeed, even though you warned them 1,000 times about how high risk this is. And so when your drug blows up and you've got nothing, you may also not really have many friends or family. And that's a serious consideration to take in because these things are very, very high risk and relationships can get really damaged. What about angel investors? So angel investors are sort of one step removed. It's not your friends and not your family, but it's that guy that somebody else knows who made a lot of money in tires or she made a lot of money in real estate and now they want to invest in that biotech stuff. What are some advantages and disadvantages to angels?
They might actually be an industry insider, so that the flip side of that tire companies like that might be a biotech.
That's exactly right. It could be that they're a biotech guy or a woman and they made a lot of money in biotech and now they want to make some more. What are some potential strengths about angels? What's a good reason to just go find an angel? An angel might have, especially if he or she's in that industry, might have a great Rolodex, might be able to tie you into other people. What are other strengths?
There'll probably be more strings than friends or family, but fewer strings than some of the other sources.
Exactly right. They might have more strings than friends and family, but significantly less than some of the institutional or venture capital. What are some real weaknesses about angels?
Yes?
You need to share your equity, maybe 10 or 20% of.
Yep.
You need to share your equity. Yeah.
Yeah. And so advantages to angels, again, a little bit similar to family and friends. It might be a lot quicker. They might be able to be, it might be like, a one-person decision-making team. Their due diligence might be a lot shorter. Disadvantages, and they might be willing to invest in an earlier stage thing. Venture capital will often say, well, show us when you got some early human results or something further along. An angel might be willing to put something into just a very early stage idea. But it will usually be less money. Again, it actually might be a lot of time managing that person, particularly if they're not somebody who's been in life sciences industry. Their expectations may be way out of line. The advice that they want to give you may not be that helpful, but you'll still have to spend a lot of time listening to it. And it may, just like friends and family, it may complicate the capitalization table of your company so that when you get to a further stage and things are going well, the people at a further stage may say, well, wait a second, you've got this list of 37 investors, each of whom is going to have some say about what happens at each different point. I don't want to invest in your company because you got such a complicated cap table.
So I have a question. Speaking of equity, what percent should you expect to hang on to once you're halfway down the list, down to the venture stage? What percent ownership do you think you're going to retain of your startup company?
90%?
90%?
That you're going to retain or the VC fund's going to retain? So as you jump to
10%?
10%?
So we have 90% and 10%.
30.
What's that?
30.
30%.
30%.
We have 30%, 90%. Anybody? Any other guesses? 20%?
All right. So as Greg's alluding to, with venture capital, some of the strengths are going to be they can put a lot of money in. Strengths will be that they may have, one hopes that they'll have relevant industry expertise, judgment, experience, relationships, etc. Weaknesses are going to be that it's going to be very expensive money. You're going to give up a lot of your company, and you'll now be a minority owner in your own company, whereas in the previous examples, you were a majority owner. And believe me, they're going to sit on your board, and they're going to control a lot. And their timetable and their needs may be different than yours in developing the company. And then things like grants, SBIR, IR, and loans, they have their own limitations. They may have some requirements, but sometimes they can also be non-diluting so that you're not giving up control. So basically, that's a busy slide, but you guys have captured it pretty well. Some of the sources that can give you larger amounts of money will also typically tend to take bigger pieces of your company and have more control to exert, but might have more expertise to give you. And on the other hand, some of the sources that are more informal may give you smaller amounts of money, take less control, but you may be trying to explain to somebody who's been in the tire industry why the FDA won't just approve your drug and let you start selling it tomorrow. So these are the questions that we asked you before. What are the largest sources of funding for biomedical research in the United States? And those are the choices that we gave you. Here are the answers that you gave. Does anybody want to change their answer? Put your hand. So about 75% said government, including NIH. Small number said non-NIH government. About 25% said corporate. And a small number said philanthropy. Global R&D from pharma is at about $120 billion a year worldwide. It's been flat for about the last 4 years. Previous to that, it went up about 11% a year. So about 120 billion or so per year. NIH invests about 31 billion annually in medical research. So this is one of the few times in your life that you'll look at $31 billion and say, oh, that's a small amount of money, because I just showed you 120 billion. And then similarly, SBIR, total program is about 3 billion annually. So now that sounds like chump change, 3 billion. And DARPA, the total R&D funding is 3 billion, but only about 100 million of that goes into biomedical research. So what should early investors be able to provide? I'm going to put up some lists. They should be able to give you immediate capital. And the point on that, I would say, is if you say we're going to raise money from venture capital, you got to remember there's going to be a long due diligence process, a long decision-making process. And so you've got to figure out how far ahead of time where you're going to need that money, and then whatever estimate you come up with, you had better double it. And if you're in a negotiation and toward the tail end of that negotiation you're running out of money, the other side will quickly figure that out because it's part of their due diligence. They will have looked at your financials. And believe me, the pressure will be turned up on you in that negotiation as we get close to your drop dead date. They should be able to provide future funding to you themselves and or to help you get future funding, to help bring other people in for the follow-on rounds that you're going to need. They should be able to play an advisory role. So you should be looking for basically what in a crude term we call smart money as opposed to dumb money. People who can not just put money into your company but can give you good advice, have a good Rolodex, helping you get in front of the people that you need to be in front of, helping you to find those other funding sources. They should give you prestige and a brand. It should be the case that they're well regarded, they're known as top tier in that area. So if you're a medical device company, you want a top tier medical device investor, so that when other people look at you as part of looking at the great board that you've put together, the great scientific advisory board, they'll also say they've got blue chip investors. Well, with them together, you will arrive at a valuation. With a valuation in that, we'll do a show of hands things. Do you want the highest possible valuation? Yes or no? Highest possible valuation, yes, put your hand up. Highest possible valuation, no, put your hand up. Why would you want the highest possible valuation? You know, Greg's going to invest $10 million in your company. You're arguing about what your pre-money should be and how much your company's worth. Why would you want the highest possible valuation? So someone said, no place to go but down.
You may actually be more worried about getting future access to cash, and so you can accept a lower valuation if they're willing to put more cash in.
Okay, take a lower valuation, but they're going to put money in the future, and you're not going to run out. What else? Why would you want to lower than the you know, if you could get the highest possible number, why would you ever settle for anything less? So on the one hand, you want the highest valuation you can have so that you don't get diluted too much. On the other hand, you want, as Bob said, you want to make sure that you don't get overvalued early, because it's a little bit like making a movie or telling a story. You want the story to be this great team with this great technology, these great patents, they got great investors, they got funded at this level, and you want to make sure that that story is and then they got funded at this level, and then they got funded at this level, and now they're going public. And if you got funded too high, you want to be funded as high, you know, quite high, because you don't want to be giving things away, but if you got funded too high early on, and then somebody brings you down to earth, that story doesn't sound so good, does it? And so who's going to want to invest in that next round of that story? I want to invest in the story about the one that goes up and up and up and up. I don't want to invest in the one that goes up and down and who knows where it's going next. So you probably,
Question
please.
over here?
Question about, I mean, you seem to be talking about all venture capital firms are the same, they're cut from the same cloth. I mean,
Yeah.
are there some that are will take less, and you know, I mean, is it something that, I mean, there are so many of them, so it seems like, are they all what you call venture capital, or
Yeah.
are they?
So the question is, are all venture capital firms the same? Are they all going to be cut from the same cloth? Are they all vulture capital and they're going to try to take all of your company if they can? And I would say absolutely, positively not. There's the full range. There are people who will basically try to view this as an ongoing relationship and to come to a fair valuation where, for example, we ideally wanted to work with an entrepreneur, take that company through to an exit, an IPO or a sale, and then work with that entrepreneur again. That was actually our favorite thing to do, was to invest in an entrepreneur who had done it successfully for us before. We knew that he or she was organized, was not crazy, was successful, got things done, was honest, and if we found that person, we wanted to do business with them again. And so we had no desire whatsoever to have that person say, well, you stuck it to me on the valuation, so I'm not coming back. And then there are other people at the other extreme that will absolutely, positively squeeze you for the last nickel, and you will never want to do business with them again. Also, there are funds that focus in specific regions, funds that focus in specific stages, ones that focus in devices versus IT versus biotech. And you want to be sure that you're getting a company, a venture capital fund, that matches your needs. So if you're early stage, you want somebody who's interested in and good at early stage. If you're late stage, you want a late stage investor, et cetera.
Quick question.
Please.
What's a good source of background information on the venture capital?
What's the source of background information?
Yeah, how do you know which company is pursuing what strategy and what the reputation is?
Sure. How do you know what strategy the venture capital fund is pursuing, and how do you know what their reputation is? So for the strategy piece, it's a little bit easier. On their website, they will typically say, we are investing in early stage, biotech or mid-stage device. You can also look at they will almost always have their portfolio companies on their website. So that's another basically statement about their strategy is, which companies have they invested in? Well, if it's a lot of, early stage biotech, well then I guess their strategy is early stage biotech. In terms of reputation, what I would recommend is, because you can see the portfolio companies they've invested in, I would recommend contacting CEOs of their existing companies and seeing who will speak off the record, but frankly with you, about what their experience with them has been. Like I said, it's like a marriage. You get to know each other very, very well. And then another thing I would do is talk to other venture capital firms and or potential acquirers who will also know. So all of these very quickly become very small worlds where everybody will know, some of the lowdown on that group or the other.
Because early stage stuff is so speculative, how do you
Yeah.
calibrate your expectations about valuation?
Sure.
Andrew?
Because early stage stuff is so speculative, how do you calibrate your expectations about valuations? Frankly, it's difficult, right? The things that can go into your expectation of your pre-money is all the things that Greg talked about before. How strong is your technology? How strong is your team? How strong are your patents? How big a market is it going after? You can look at, if this succeeds, how much money is it going to take going in at each point? And then how much money can we anticipate will come out and at what point? And basically do a discount, net present value, where you take a discounted cash flow and say, well, we got to put 20 million in now, we got to put 25 million in 3 years, we got to put 50 million in 2 years after that. But companies like what we're aiming to become have sold in the last period for around $750 million. We would expect that would happen 9 years from today. So what's that come down to? So this is actually to that point, talking about how much money it takes, 900 million or more, how long, 10 years, to get a drug all the way through. And the point on that is that people are going to be putting a lot of money in at different points, and they're going to be getting their money out at much later points. And you just got to think about the time value of money, that them getting their money out several years from now is worth less than money delivered today. After all, if I'm going to give you $1, do you want it now or do you want it 5 years from now? Today it's worth $1. If I promise it to you 5 years from now, it's not worth $1 today. And so you got to think about that when you're negotiating about valuation. So very briefly, just a simple point that you have to understand about venture capital funds for when you're interacting with them is how do they make their money? So the general partners, who are the venture capitalists, they invest in your company, and hopefully your company goes public or gets sold and they get money out. The returns, initially the first 100% of the money goes to the limited partners. That's the university endowment fund, the pension fund, the insurance company that put money into the VC fund. So first, they get their money back, all right? After they've gotten all their money back, then typically any more money that comes in gets split 80% to those investors in the fund, the limited partners, the university endowment, and 20% goes to the general partners, the venture capitalists. What that means is the venture capitalists have a huge incentive to invest in companies that are going to be worth a lot. Because if they invest in companies that are just going to return the money, they don't get paid anything other than the management fee. And if they invest in companies that get sold for twice the initial, well, they only get 20% of half of that total amount. But if they get a 27x or a 32x, now you're talking some real money. So the incentive for the venture capitalist is to invest in something that's going to be very valuable. And that's why if you go in and talk to a venture capitalist about your great idea, which is a sure thing, and it's going to be an $8 million revenue company next year and every year after that for the rest of your life, their eyes will glaze over. And you'll wonder why, because, my God, this company's a sure thing. It's going to make $8 million every year from now till eternity. What's not to love? When you think about that model, you'll realize there's nothing to love, at least for the venture capitalist. It might be a great company for you. So when you look at a venture capital fund or of any potential investor, here are the things that I think you have to ask yourself is, does your plan fit the needs of the venture capital fund? And the corollary to that, are they a good fit for you? Are you ready for venture capital? It's very expensive and a lot of loss of control. Are you prepared to become a minority stockholder in your own company and to lose control of your baby? But your baby may grow up to be really, really big. Make sure the VC you're going to work with can add value. So there's a lot of sources of money like we talked about. This is an expensive source, so it better come with some good advice, some industry expertise, having been through very similar FDA experiences many times before successfully, a great Rolodex, a lot of friends who, a lot of other funds who will invest alongside them in the future when you need it. Understand where in the fund life cycle you're at. If the fund is late in their fund life cycle, they're not making new investments, so you're wasting your time talking to them. VC funds typically have about a 10-year life cycle in life sciences. The first 1 to 3 years are when they tend to make their initial investments. Later on, it's about follow-on investments and then harvesting. Keep remembering, all financing sources are not the same, so think about which ones suit your needs, and talk to portfolio company CEOs. Just one slide on negotiating, because the minute you start talking to somebody about funding, you're negotiating from the very beginning. So anchoring is a very simple psychological point. If you're selling your car to me, and your car could be worth between $10,000 and $15,000, and you can get me to start discussing the value of your car at around $15,000, the chances are we're going to end up closing the deal overly close to $15,000. That you are going to, by anchoring, you're going to pull me closer to that top number of the reasonable zone than otherwise would have happened. And if I can get you to start the discussion and the negotiation real close to $10,000, the chances are that I'm going to anchor you at $10,000. We're going to end up real close to the $10,000 end of that zone. So what do you want to do? You want to anchor the negotiations near the end of the zone that suits your needs. And if somebody else is anchoring you, you want to recognize that immediately and do a little jujitsu on them and get it back to your side. What's the BATNA? You've got to walk into every negotiation understanding what's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So if you're selling me your car, but you know that you could turn it in to a dealer, and all things being equal, you got $11,000 from the dealer, all right, that's your alternative. Well, that tells you what your reservation value is. In other words, if I'm not going to offer you $11,001, you're going to walk away, and you've got to go into your negotiation knowing those numbers, those terms in your head. And then finally, the ZOPA is the zone of possible agreement. That's between the highest number that would possibly get paid and the lowest number. What's the zone which in this negotiation could reasonably come to an agreement? If you're going to go to VC, you've got to know how many deals are being done and what amounts of money. So in the first quarter of this year, 162 deals were done, $1.9 billion. That's life science venture capital investments, new and follow-on investments. Don't forget that corporate venture capital can be an important source. So pretty much all of the pharmas and a lot of the large biotechs have their own venture capital arms. And so corporate VC did 137 deals, 12 deals, $137 million in the first quarter. And there's some indication that pre-money valuations, median pre-money valuations are coming down, perhaps because the number of VC funds is decreasing, so competition. But that also may be a data blip.
I heard that there's a firewall in terms of corporate venture funds and maybe the rest of the pharmaceutical company. What's the integrity of that firewall?
Sure. So the question is there's supposed to be a firewall between the pharma VC fund and the rest of the pharma where they don't tell all of your secrets. And I would say you should also think about that with VC funds that are not corporate. Because if you look at a VC fund and you're thinking of approaching them for them to invest in your rheumatoid arthritis monoclonal antibody, and they've got one or two other companies that are developing rheumatoid arthritis monoclonal antibodies, you've got to ask yourself, are you going to go give a very detailed presentation which is going to be partially or completely sort of passed along? The reasons why it wouldn't is if they're interested in being in business for the long term, if they get a reputation for leaking secrets, no one will ever come to them. The reasons why they might is they might be desperate to help their company succeed by sharing your information, and they might disregard the legal implications of doing that. The same thing can be true in large pharma. You're going to sign non-disclosure agreements. Greg, do you have a thought from the corporate venture capital side of this?
I think you should assume that everybody has good intentions, but that information leaks. That being said, I think people do try to honor the integrity, the spirit of the deal. But information gets into people's heads, and it's hard to keep track of when they're synthesizing things, to sort of understand a market overview, where exactly that information came from. So it's just something to be cautionary about. With corporate venture capital, I think there is a firewall in terms of the corporate VC taking information and dropping it on the business unit. So I don't think that's much of a concern. At least I've never heard of it being a concern. On the other hand, there's a strategic question here, which is it's pretty uncommon for a corporate venture, a corporation that has strength in, say, oncology and neuroscience, to have a corporate venture unit that invests in infectious disease. So there's typically strategic alignment between the two. Not always. And the other thing that could happen with corporate VC is that they could have a business unit that's very strong in neuroscience, but then all their drugs go off patent, and halfway through the life of your company, there's a strategic shift in the corporation, and they're dumping all their CNS investments.
And that's, I think, a very important point in terms of how your needs may or may not align with their needs, and may stay aligned or may really diverge.
So some thoughts about protecting your business. And let's think about it from the point of view of protection. So this is the intellectual property section. So other than and in addition to intellectual property, how do you protect your assets? And this is somewhat biotech focused. Yep.
Trade secrets?
Trade secrets?
Regulatory path to take, or PMA.
Regulatory path, exactly. And thinking about regulatory path, so there is, your clinical data is protected. There's protection around the regulatory path. Can you think of any specific examples within the regulatory environment that provide protection?
Well, like PMA, for example, if you don't enable your competitors to claim you as a predicate device, then you have the ability to have that as a pretty fortified. I've heard two angels tell me in the last 2 weeks that PMA is probably stronger than any patent out there right now.
So the statement is the PMA for devices is potentially stronger than patents. And you know the life overlap, there's patents go for how many years? 17 years, 17 to 20. Typically you get your PMA later on in the life of your product. So from that point of view, there's protection. Other regulatory sources of protection?
Partnership agreements?
Pardon? Agreements?
With other companies, suppliers?
So you could have strength in your business model. Yep, exactly. Yes? Or exactly, orphan designation. Do you know how many years it gives you in the United States? 7 years in the US and 10 in Europe. Yeah, exactly. All right, good. So we talked about patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets, brand identity. You know, Tylenol is acetaminophen. It's off patent, but still, it's a very powerful brand. There's business models. You know, so the data agreements, information agreements. IMS is the giant in the pharmaceutical sales data space. You know, basically because they got there first, not because of any patents. Data protection and regulatory protection, like we said.
Just on that note then, does having first mover advantage give you any protection? It's not legal protection, but...
Does first mover advantage give you protection? I think the answer, honestly, is which category we're looking at. So definitely when it comes to the top of the list, about patents, trademark, copyrights, and trade secrets. We can sort of debate once you're going down into sort of business models and if there's almost a first mover disadvantage of being more difficult to sort of break into a pathway. But in certain cases, absolutely right. Yes?
I'm surprised to hear you say that PMA is an appropriate pathway, even though it offers some potential protection. Because I was thinking that at least I'm from med device, and PMA is like the absolute last place we ever want to go, and all we ever hear from investors is they don't want to go PMA, they'd rather stay with PMA. So could you kind of clarify and discuss a little bit more about your willingness to try out and fund PMA?
So the question is, you know, PMA as the designation for a medical device versus a 510K pathway. And maybe, I don't know if people are familiar with the term, but what is, you know, very briefly, what's the difference between the two?
510K is based off a predicate device. So
510K is based off a predicate device. So basically you refer to an existing device. It's roughly analogous to the ANDA pathway for drugs, which is the generic drug pathway. So you don't do a clinical trial, you do a paper NDA, an ANDA, you refer to an existing filing. And in a PMA?
PMA, there is no predicate device, so you'll have to go through the long FDA process, which takes you into clinical trials.
Takes you into clinical trials, so it's analogous to an NDA in drugs, or a BLA in biologicals. So what could be the possible advantage? Why would you possibly want to go down the PMA pathway? Well, what's the possible disadvantages? Longer? Ask the venture capitalist.
Costs more.
Cost more? So what's the possible, so why would anybody possibly want to go down a PMA pathway? Actually, somebody in the audience said this phrase previously in relation to something else.
Well, once you're FDA approved, you have a higher likeliness of people buying your drug.
I'm not hearing everything you said, but once you're FDA approved, you have
A higher likeliness of people purchasing your drug.
you have a higher so once you're approved by the FDA, I mean so there's a higher likelihood of people purchasing your drug, but specifically getting that FDA approval, because it's so difficult, it just creates a huge barrier for other people to do the same thing. And in fact, there is protection in of itself of going down an NDA versus a PMA pathway. So it's a trade-off. And you know, as a small company, I think you have to decide which direction you want to go, and then you start thinking about funding sources, getting up, you know, we showed the biotech numbers for 12 to 15 years to get to a drug approval. It's somewhat different lifespan for devices, but you start thinking about when do you access other sources of capital when you need to move up that pathway. Yes.
I'm not sure I understand what barrier it's putting up. If somebody can file a 510K right after you file your PMA.
You can't use the PMA as part.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did the first device get there? So how did a 510K? So
There's
there's a
a-
510K on that.
You can't use, I'm in this turmoil right now, so I can tell you, you cannot use predicate, which was originally a PMA, as a predicate.
I guess my question is, so then what's the predicate to the 510K?
So I'm going to defer this to people who know more about devices, but my thinking was that there's a time limit for PMAs, after which you can do a 510K. But you guys probably know better.
No, my understanding is that it has to piggyback off of like something from like the 70s or 80s.
So it's grandfather thing.
So it's grandfather.
Yeah.
So it becomes, as I was talking to someone, it becomes like a medical device game of telephone where it has to originate from something more. But I think a new PMA, you can't piggyback off of a new one. But again,
Right. So, but for the 510K, it gets grandfathered in. But she's totally right that it's many years ago, and they're right now actually trying to change that ruling and make it more difficult. The PMA, once you obtain a PMA, that device or whatever it may be, it will be very difficult for it to become a predicate status in the future for several years until there's enough clinical data. In the FDA, you could try it, but the FDA just probably will just say, well, no, it's still a PMA or PMA, and we're not quite sure about it. So it'll just take some time.
So I think that's a good point. Basically in summary, the regulatory pathways are complex, and there are inherent risks. And it's even more complicated when you're going for innovation in biologics. So there is no equivalent to a 510K or an ANDA or bioequivalent pathway in the United States, which there is in Europe, but not in the US and Canada. I think the take-home message is that clearly think through regulatory pathways if you're going the device or product route. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this. There's legal protection, and then there's regulatory exclusivity. We mentioned orphan drug status, which gives you there's specific definitions that have to be met based on market size. There's also other designations you can go for, like pediatric indications. But again, and these tend to overlap. So going forward, you can rely more on market or on regulatory exclusivity versus patents. And there are certainly drugs that have gone this pathway without having a patent, but relied exclusively on regulatory exclusivity. We alluded to this earlier. There's a funny inverted relationship between companies that are focused on innovative medical products, whether it's drugs, biologics, or devices, versus health IT, and where it's less advantageous to have intellectual property. And a final word on what it takes to get patented. I mean, these are the criteria. Your idea has to be novel, it has to be useful, and it has to be non-obvious. So I think there's going to be a patent discussion at some point down the road, but just to sort of seed those ideas in your mind. We talked earlier about what are some of the critical aspects, of the critical elements. So understanding the market. Big markets are better than smaller markets. Underserved markets are better than served markets. But everybody kind of knows that. So I wanted to present just some thoughts about how to be disciplined about sizing the markets that you're going after, and to be able to demonstrate that discipline in your business plan or in your discussion with investors. Everybody says, it's easy for people to say, if I only have 1% of that market, you need to be a little bit more sophisticated. Understanding not just what the total population is, but drilling down into the prevalence rate, how many of those people suffering that particular problem have actually been identified, what can affect the rate of diagnosis today versus when your product hits the market. Is this something that could be influenced by discoveries in translational medicine or in personalized medicine? Are there negative factors affecting the market that you need to take into consideration, like an onslaught of competitive drugs that are going to hit the market 2 years before yours hit the market? These are the kinds of things you need to think through, and these are the kinds of arguments that you need to make pretty crisply when you're talking to potential investors. Also think about what's the mindset around relatively large markets right now versus where they're going. So these are not static markets. And some things that in the past would have been considered tremendous opportunities, like cardiovascular, et cetera, respiratory drugs, are actually, the market is somewhat in decline, with a lot of generics and less innovation in particular. So again, think about the market in a dynamic way, not just a static way. And also think about innovation. Whether the products the argument that you're making is something that is in a trend where the market is expanding or is relatively flat. And I just put this up to compare the growth rate in biologics versus biotechnology in general versus conventional small molecules, where the growth rate is higher, you see across the top bar. In fact, about 12% growth rate in biotherapeutics versus about 4% growth rate in small molecules over the past couple of years. Okay. Any thoughts, questions about that? We talked about the key aspects of your company in terms of valuation and getting started: intellectual property, data, and management. But then you also have to think about how you're going to run this company going forward. particularly if you're coming from a non-business background. As we said, the number of drugs that actually make it to clinical trial and the success rate in clinical trials is relatively difficult, and the amount of money that it takes to get into clinical trials is a lot. So as you're driving your company forward, you're operating in a space where the investors and the long-term thinkers, the board, is thinking about these challenges in front of you. So how are you going to navigate those costs, the clinical costs, and how are you going to navigate the complexity of the regulatory process, which we just talked about? So if you're going to weigh your emphasis, weigh it towards the things that will strengthen the value of your company. Intellectual property and clinical data. And again, if you don't have clinical data, what's going to put you on the pathway to get to clinical data? Because the investor and even savvy employees are going to be thinking, what's the next milestone that we're driving towards? And your funding, the round of funding that you've developed, should get you across the finish line to the next funding milestone, the next fundable milestone. So in clinical development, this typically goes with the clinical trial process. If you're before clinical development, it goes. There are proof of concept stages. There's animal testing stages. Getting halfway there can be a challenge. If you raise just enough money to do half the clinical trial, then people are going to wonder, well, why is this situation? Was this trial poorly designed? Did it take too long? Why didn't the original investors fund it to get you to the next milestone, the next valuation inflection point?
And 2 quick points on milestones. One is you can use milestones as a negotiating tactic if you have a big gap between what you think your company is worth and what potential investors think it's worth. Is you can basically say, okay, we'll agree that we're both right. And we'll agree that if I hit these milestones that I'm promising, I'm saying this is going to be a huge drug that's going to sail through trials, then you will reward me for that valuation. And if I take much longer to develop and I don't hit as big a market, et cetera, then you'll pay me much less. So with milestones, you can basically say, we can both agree on the valuation that we see as we sit here today, and just depending on which milestones we hit or don't hit, the valuation will change accordingly. And that way you can agree to basically accept both of your visions of what's going to happen going forward, and the milestones will determine which one was correct. The other thing I would say is many times investors are very hesitant to invest right before some sort of important milestone result is going to come out. So if you run out of money 3 months before that phase 2 clinical trial is going to be done, it's very uncomfortable to invest in you at that moment, because I don't want to invest in you and then 3 months after I invested, find out that that was a huge mistake. I'd like at least like a year or 2 before I find out that it was a huge mistake. It looks a lot better. Yeah.
Can you talk
Yes.
about designing milestones in licensing agreements? So often this is kind of has different motivations around it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's around designing milestones and licensing agreements. So in general, licensing agreements are very back-end loaded and tend to be back-end loaded in life sciences with a relatively small amount up front, but then very much milestone driven in terms of the amount of money that companies will put in. And these large corporations tend to be extremely risk averse for a variety of reasons, which are both financial and cultural. But they would much rather spend $1 billion in something that's a relatively sure thing than $100 million in something that's very highly risky. So, the way they'll manage it is that they'll create a license agreement that'll give you $10 million up front, or just enough to keep the lights on, to keep going, to get to the next success milestone. And then based on that successful milestone, again, the key drivers of the valuation of the company are going to be, in biotechnology or life sciences at least, are going to be the strength of your intellectual property and the clinical data you generate. So once you get to phase 1, phase 2A, a funding milestone kicks in, phase 2A, or 2B funding milestone kicks in, et cetera. Till what point happens? You might have funding milestones going all the way through till you get on the market. But then there's a key inflection point. It's a sort of a financial engineering question. At some point, it gets more expensive to pay your milestones than just to take over the company.
What about when you're licensing IP from a university, for example? Those are often milestone payments, but you'd like to design them in a way that you're going to meet them. Are there any strategies for, do they tend to be the same milestones?
So another good question around licensing from a university to take hold of your intellectual property. The short answer is that there's sort of generally accepted standards, and most of the licensing departments around here generally will stick to those, which is typically single-digit royalty rates that escalate once the product's on the market. The other thing that licensing offices want you to pick up is the maintenance fees, and they might put in expectations for you to be financially committed, not just to uphold this patent, but to strengthen the IP on the patent portfolio, or basically expect you to create a stronger and stronger patent portfolio. They want all those charges off their books. Universities just are never going to have the same number of resources in terms of intellectual property lawyers as corporations who are sitting there kind of poring over this, for a living. So it's a rule of thumb. I don't know how true it is, but sort of the general rule of thumb is that university patents tend to not have been the full searches haven't always been done. Kind of the rigor hasn't always been put in that you would get from a major company patent. So are often disappointments when a patent that's been executed by a university then is put up to the corporate lawyers, and they run a search and they find out that they believe it's invalid.
Do they take equity as well as the royalties?
They do take equity. That's right. And there's some universities that have really benefited tremendously from that. So good questions. Just some thinking about management. Again, I think we hit on the point that investors would. Well, this was a question. I think this is actually a question we put out. Right? What are the job titles that are necessary to get your company started? What's the minimum? Scientist and CEO? CFO, somebody said? Okay, this is, so we'll get to your results in a second. Right, so chief scientist, chief executive, chief financial officer, head of the scientific board, chair of the board, founder. What's the number one job of everybody here? Funding. Try to get funding. Maybe less so the chair of the scientific board. But especially when you're in a small company, these were your answers. Kind of said the same thing. Chief scientist, chief executive. It depends on the nature of the company. That role can be also performed by the founder. But basically, the two people, you want somebody who's going to run the company, and you want somebody who's going to go out and raise money, and you want both of those people to go out and raise money. Any thoughts about that?
I would say when we had a choice, the thing that we were looking for most was a chief executive who had done essentially something exactly analogous to what was on the table and had done it before successfully to the point of an exit. So, it was great if we saw somebody who'd worked many years at a large pharma, but that doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily take this small biotech company through to acquisition or IPO. What we wanted to see was somebody who had taken something very, very similar through the whole process from where we're standing today through to an exit, ideally more than once, and now was back to do it again. That was the thing that we liked to see the most. And then, and in an ideal world, we liked it to be someone who we had worked with before, so we knew that they were going to be reasonable to work with.
So if you're a founder, it sounds like it's in your best interest to latch on to somebody who's done it, or bring somebody in who's done it before?
You know, again, I would say it depends, and it depends on the stage of the company. So one of the other things that you need to think about is how, as your company is maturing, it's going to go through a cycle of being very much, I mean, let's call it founder-driven or startup-driven, where you're reactive to what's going on. You're really, you know, going out, getting your next milestone, your next round of fundraising. At some point, hopefully, you need to be more strategically oriented. And so founders are a bit tricky, because what's a tough sell is to look for investors and say, hey, look, I've got this cool technology, I've got this cool invention. I don't really want to run this company. It's not really, you know, management isn't really for me, but let's go get some money first, and then we'll put a management team into place. That's a pretty hard sell. So you tend to get, smaller companies tend to get funded by founders who want to be there and run it and are very passionate and move it forward. The challenge then is once you get to the stage where a company is running to the next level, and, you know, do you have any comments about founders?
Well, so what I would say is what I was describing was what we ideally wanted, not what you ideally want, right? So I would say, no, run your thing until you reach some point where you think there's more value to having somebody else run it, you know, and however you define value for yourself. And if that stage never happens, continue to run your thing. I mean, I was describing our, you know, the venture capitalist perspective, the ideal, but if we found somebody who'd never done it before but had a great technology, a great market, great IP, and had a skill set that looked like he or she was going to be able to do it, you know, we certainly, there were times that we invested in that, and if you feel like you've got the passion, the knowledge, the skill set to do it, then I would say hand it over to somebody else only on the day when you think there's more value for you in handing it over, and not a second later and not a second earlier.
And there is sometimes, you know, this term professional management is tossed around, that depending on who the founder is and what their background is, you know, the Facebook story is very unusual. Of, you know, the inventor is the founder, is the guy who takes it, you know, to the multi-billion-dollar valuation. You know, the story of Microsoft, you know, the story of Apple is very, very unusual. It's much more typical for the founder to take it to a certain stage, and you bring in professional management. So there is more often than not the expectation that and this goes to the control issue. Once you're beyond 51%, you don't really have the legal right to demand that you're going to be the CEO forever. Yeah. And the board can come and swap out CEOs.
One thing that I would say came up with founders far more common actually as an issue was the founder who was not willing to relinquish control of his or her baby. Now that's not acceptable. If we put several $1 million in and we're the majority owner, everyone's going to have a voice, but it can't be somebody who has a sort of, I'm the inventor, I know this thing, no one else knows what to do with it, how to do it, I've got to make it. And you can pick up on that pretty quickly. First meeting, maybe second meeting. If you start to get that feeling, right on out of there.
Yep.
I'm just wondering, is it any coincidence that the three companies you referenced as being unusual are like the three most successful?
The three most successful.
He left out Dell Computers.
That's right. Ford, there's another one. I mean, it's easy to think of kind of the high flying models. There are just numerically there are far more companies that get management replaced. You know, sometimes in a very high profile way, like Groupon. You know, more often than not, they're just replaced. You know, I think it's an interesting question, and I don't know. You know, at least the articles that I've seen are that the founder taking it all the way is the exception, not the rule. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
I think your point's well made. I think it is you can argue it both ways forever, and I've heard it argued both ways more times than I can count about, do you want to bring in the person who's, 40 years at Pfizer and Novartis and this and that, the other to take it over, versus do you want the, younger person who's probably higher energy, a little hungrier, et cetera. And I think that's what, people get it right and people get it wrong going either way.
So, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the very early stages when only the founders have equity and they're now start to pay people with equity, and what kind of equity you give them and how much, advisors and things like that?
So the early stages when it's only the founders with the equity, and then you said how to pay for?
How do you want to pay an advisor or a consultant with equity, and there's no valuation because there's been no fundraising?
Mm-hmm.
What percent and what type of equity and vesting over 4 years, or can you talk a little about that?
So the question is, what are the types of shares at the very earliest stages, and then how should you think about distributing those shares? So they're typically founder shares at the very beginning. If it really is just a founder or co-founder, I myself went through the same situation with a company called Immunome, that we wrote the business plan, we decided how to divide up the shares, and my colleague, also from Yale Medical School, was a MD PhD. He was the smart guy behind the plan, and for really no logical reason, we divided it up 60-40 in his favor. But I would say that was an unfair way to divide it, because this was his technology and his baby to drive. And he's still the CEO of the company, and I'm on the board and an advisor, but it's still his baby. I wound up giving back 20% of my stake to make it more equal. And the reason is that those founders' shares are the most expensive shares possible. They're not worth anything, but they're going to be worth it's the largest percentage that will ever be owned by individuals ever in the history of the company. And that's what we started experiencing, that we got angel investors coming in, we got the first million in, we got more money coming in, and it was just difficult to start parsing it out, because those founders' shares then become the lowest priority, the lowest, not maturity, the lowest seniority equity within the hierarchy. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time, so that once you're new classes of shares are going to get added once you start raising rounds, but preferred shares will go to the investors, and the founders' shares will always stay small. Then options will be added to the pool, which again, the option pool, the preferred shares, everything will dilute down the founders' shares. So, overemphasizing the point that those founders' shares are incredibly precious. So be extremely careful about how much you give away. In our experience, we gave away a fraction of a percent to advisors. When we brought in a CEO, they got single-digit percentages. And everything below that was basically less than that. Half of what the CEO got or less. But be very, very careful about paying with founders' equity, because as soon as the money starts coming in, that stuff squeezes down and dries up very quickly. Comment? Yeah.
There's quite a bit of data that's been captured in this issue. Noam Wasserman, the professor at UPS, wrote a great book on this called The Founder's Dilemma, which is pretty much the Bible on this data. There's also a website called CompStudy, which has a high-tech and a biotech group, where there's a lot of research that's been shown about exactly how much percent the market gives out relative to stage investment and size of company, all kinds of other location geography. It's pretty well documented to state what the market gives and what's kind of appropriate to do.
Yep.
One point I'd add about when you're talking about dilution, everyone thinks about another round of funding, getting more diluted, getting more diluted, getting more diluted. Remember, if you play a very key role, if you're the founder, CEO, and everybody who's invested in investing realizes that you're critical to the success, it's quite possible to very successfully demand to be re-upped. So as opposed to just getting diluted each time around, you can very much say, well, at this point I only own 3% of this company. unless you guys re-up me, it's not going to be worth my while to stay around. And as long as you're confident that your role is that critical, you will get re-upped.
Yes?
About how you interact with people who remain in academia, both from an IP perspective, rewarding them with equity. They often bring the gravitas early on if they're an inventor.
How do you interact with and
So they
reward
seem-
people in
yeah,
academia?
They seem to expect, although they're not there sort of sweating day by day, there seems to be an expectation that they're somehow, I don't know, bringing the gravitas.
There's an expectation that they want some share of the company. True, that is true. There's probably other ways that you can work with them.
Yeah, I guess there are ways to design something to get something from that relationship, so you can sort of appropriately reward and
That's right. There's other ways that you can sort of create the financial arrangements, and there's also other types of instruments that you can give them, particularly options, so that if they're going to execute an option, at least there's some money that they need to put in. Options are a little bit of a tricky one because typically they have to be pegged off of a certain valuation, and there's tax implications, et cetera. But I would say that everyone's going to be after your founder shares. So again, just be very, as much of a cheapskate as possible about how much you give away. And SAB members, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's fractions of a percent is probably in the right zone. Again, depending on where you are.
Two quick points. As I serve, on the faculty of the medical school and then scientific advisory boards. There are very clear university regulations about what you can and cannot accept. And as the company, you'll want to make sure that you know them too, because you wouldn't want somebody to violate them and then get you involved in, a scandal of some sort. And the other thing is you can't give shares to somebody in most institutions who would then be in any way involved in human research involving your product, because you wouldn't want somebody doing clinical trials on patients who had a stake, an equity stake in the company, so would care how it came out in a financial way. So therefore, if you're looking at somebody who's the world's expert on that subject, but 4 years from now you might want that person to be leading your trial because that would be great for your company, then you don't want to give them equity today to serve on the scientific advisory board, because that might preclude them from doing human research involving your product.
Could you just clarify your point about this founder shares? I mean, if you're going to get diluted down, so you gave 60% or you had 40% of that company, say, but after all the VCs came in, you both had, you had 6% maybe, and you had 4%. So why do you say that's expensive? It's not 40% of the final company you're holding on to.
But that's exactly the point, because it goes from what feels like a relatively large percentage to a relatively small percentage. And the difference between having 4% and 5% at that point becomes very painful.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was, in our case, it was just what was fair. So let me show one slide about partnerships. There's a lot to be talked about with partnerships, but I wanted to show the results of an interesting survey about what it is that pharmaceutical companies are looking for when they're looking for partners. And the top category here is that they want to tap into innovation. So they really see working with small companies, working with biotechnology, working with other innovators as a way for them to get a window on what some of the most exciting science is, or business innovation, or what some of the most innovative thinking is that they don't necessarily own or control. Capabilities is another possibility, such as biologics, genomics, et cetera. And you can read down the list. Yes.
How do they typically deal with IP? Are they co-development relationships? Do you retain the IP as a small company?
If you think from the point of view of the IP is one of the fundamental assets of the company, then the answer is whoever owns the company owns the IP. And if there's one patent in the company and you create a license where the pharmaco owns all the rights to the company, you've kind of carved out your company and basically made it more of a holding company or a shell for royalty payments. But they'll probably request that. So let me pause there. It's the bottom of the hour. We didn't leave much time for questions, but we can take some questions now, or we can stick around afterwards.
General. So when Vertex came up with the cystic fibrosis drug, they were developing cystic fibrosis drug. Not many people were in that, but the minute they got positive POC in the clinic, many big pharma kind of enter into that indication. Having said that, if I have to start tomorrow a company in cystic fibrosis, already Vertex is ahead. Big pharma has their own fund; they are also coming up. Would you fund me based on, the competition and all that? I may not, but just an example. Like how will you see that as a new inventor want to get into that particular area?
And so the question is, how would you see it now if you come along with cystic fibrosis and there's already some products in place? To a certain extent, you might actually see that as a positive in the sense of having proved that this can be done. One thing that I was taught early on is if you're going to ski off a cliff, at least don't ski off a cliff that like 25 other people already skied off of in front of you. And what that meant was, for example, you take spinal cord injury, and there really haven't been any drugs that have worked for that, right? So if you're a venture capitalist and you're looking at new things, right now you probably are going to really hesitate before you're going to invest in a spinal cord injury company because everyone else who did this has failed. And so if you're going to fail, at least fail down a new trail. And in the flip side of that, you would have said that about cystic fibrosis before if it had been 30 shots that all missed. Now that one shot hit, or maybe 2 shots have hit, okay, now you're more interested. And it's hard to imagine that existing drugs in pipelines are going to come close to solving all the needs of cystic fibrosis patients, right? Multiple sclerosis, there's a list as long as my arm, but there's still plenty of room for better therapies. And in most areas of medicine, that's the case as well. So as long as you can document that on the one hand, someone else succeeded and you're going to succeed, but there's something about your technology that is going to work a lot better, that's actually then very, very appealing, I would say.
So in short, whether you are best in class or first in class, it does not matter whether you are best in class or you want to be first in class. You need to make good story in order to kind of get the funding.
Yeah, and what's the advantage of your medication going to be? Is it going to be more effective? Is it going to be better tolerated? Is it going to treat some subgroup that isn't well treated by the existing? Is there some large subgroup that can't tolerate the existing? Walk me through that market and where you're going to fit into it and when you're going to get there and what your chances of success are.
I have one question about the location. So US states differ in the enforcement of non-compete agreements. How would that affect access to human resources, and also from the investor perspective, from the behavior of investors when investing, person coming out of a research lab at an existing company versus a research lab at that university in that region.
So the question's about location, and I don't know if I heard the first part of the question about
non-competes.
Oh, non-competes.
So is there anything that the person has to be careful about this thing, non-competes, getting the human resources?
So the questions around non-competes. I mean, non-competes tend to be a bit of a tricky thing, and depending on what state you're in, they can be more or less difficult to enforce. But it's another risk. I mean, if you're talking about if you're talking about getting people from a certain who are specialists in a certain area, you're introducing more risks to what you're trying to put together. And I think from an investor point of view, from a management point of view, you want to limit your exposure to risks. So I don't know if there's a kind of a hard and fast rule about whether it's academia or companies or whatnot. Certainly, if somebody's working in a company and has an invention, it's pretty hard to expect that they can walk away from that company without having licensed the invention. I mean, same thing with academia.
Please.
Yes.
I'm interested to know if you've got a product that requires requires a technical partner to come in with you to develop the product fully. How do you go about negotiating equity in that example?
So the question is, how do you negotiate equity when you need to develop a partner, to develop a product with a technical partner? I think if you're early stage enough that you're still using equity as cash, and you can find somebody who's willing to take on the risk to co-development, I think you just have to look at the valuation of the value that you're giving up relative to where you think the companies are going to go, and how much you're giving up. It could be potentially a pretty smart thing to do, but I would sort of start playing with the valuations and think about being milestone driven. These guys are going to take me to what stage? At that stage, what's going to be the value of the company based on some benchmarks? And then how does that affect my share versus other money coming in?
So we should probably stop there, and then we'll take questions for anyone who wants to hang around afterwards. Be happy to.
So if you guys could all join in thanking both of our speakers.